The silence did not come gently. It arrived after decades of music that defined joy for millions, after stadium lights dimmed, after applause faded into memory. At 78, Benny Andersson stood not at a piano, but at the edge of a life filled with unanswered questions, private regrets, and a truth long buried beneath melody. For years, the world believed it knew him, the smiling architect behind ABBA's timeless anthems, the calm genius who turned heartbreak into harmony. But behind the perfection of pop, there was a woman whose absence shaped his deepest wounds, a presence that haunted every triumph that followed. This was not a story sung on vinyl, nor one preserved in glossy photographs. It was carried in silence, in nights where success felt hollow, in moments where fame could not quiet the past. Why did one relationship leave scars no chart-topping hit could erase? And why did he choose now, at this late hour of life, to finally let the truth surface? The answers lie not in the music the world remembers, but in the pain it never heard. The streets of Stockholm in the late 1940s were quiet, almost hesitant, as if the city itself sensed the fragile lives unfolding within its brick-lined avenues. Young Benny Andersson wandered these streets with a restless curiosity, his small hands often brushing the cold metal of bicycle handlebars or the chipped edges of worn benches. At home, the walls were lined with the lingering echoes of music, an old phonograph playing records that spun tales of love, of longing, of lives far beyond the reach of his small room. Yet amidst the melodies, there was silence of another kind, a silence shaped by emotional distance, by unspoken words that hovered like ghosts over dinner tables, in hallways, and behind closed doors. His parents' expectations were heavy, though never articulated. Their pride in him existed as an abstract, sometimes distant force, leaving him to navigate the complexities of his own feelings alone. From the earliest age, Benny discovered that music could hold what words could not. The piano in the corner of the living room became more than an instrument. It became a confidant, a witness to the confusion of a boy who felt simultaneously cherished and unseen. Fingers brushed over keys with both urgency and hesitation, producing notes that were at once tender and urgent. In the dim light of the late afternoon, the soft hum of a melody could quiet his anxieties, give shape to fears he could not name, and offer a fleeting sense of control over a world that often seemed unyielding. Each chord was an assertion, a way of saying, "I exist, I feel, I matter," even if no one spoke those words aloud to him. Yet beneath this early talent, there was a wound, a quiet ache that gnawed at his sense of belonging. Benny feared that love was conditional, a fragile thing that could slip away without warning. He watched friends receive praise effortlessly, siblings bask in affection he yearned for, and he carried an ever-present anxiety that any moment of happiness might dissolve into disappointment. It was a fear that followed him through playground games, school recitals, and small local performances, a subtle shadow that shaped the contours of his ambitions and the depth of his emotional restraint. Even as early opportunities began to surface, hints of recognition that promised a future beyond the narrow streets of his youth, Benny felt incomplete. His talent was undeniable, yet the emotional scaffolding of his life remained fragile. It was a paradox. The more he played, the more the world noticed, the more he felt the absence of a love he could neither name nor demand. He stood on the cusp of something extraordinary, yet unaware that the patterns of longing, avoidance, and guarded intimacy formed in his childhood would collide with a love in adulthood that would define, challenge, and reshape him entirely. The quiet piano notes lingered in the shadows of his small room as Benny looked toward the future, oblivious to the storm of heartache and emotional reckoning that waited just beyond the threshold. The boy who had learned to translate pain into music was about to meet a love that could neither be tamed nor ignored. The world was shifting, and Benny Andersson was caught in its accelerating rhythm. ABBA's sound had begun to emerge, a luminous fusion of melody and harmony that promised fame, adoration, and a life beyond the quiet streets of Stockholm. Yet beneath the glimmering surface, Benny's heart was tethered to a woman whose presence both grounded and haunted him, a love that existed in the fragile spaces between rehearsals, late-night recordings, and the endless obligations of a life in motion. She was not merely a partner. She was a mirror reflecting his deepest tenderness and, simultaneously, the fears he had cultivated since childhood. In dimly lit studios, the click of metronomes and the hum of amplifiers filled the air. Yet Benny's attention often drifted to her face, the subtle arch of her brow, the half-smile that seemed to question him even as she encouraged him. Their conversations were layered with nuance, soft laughter masking hesitation, gentle touches carrying the weight of unsaid words. Love, in its purest form, should have been effortless, yet Benny's fear of vulnerability made intimacy feel perilous. Every tender moment was shadowed by the quiet dread that it could slip away, leaving behind the familiar ache of absence. He had learned early that to protect himself, he must retreat, yet every withdrawal carried consequences he could scarcely admit to himself. As ABBA's music began to fill rooms and radios, as audiences clutched at the joy the songs offered, Benny wrestled with the contradiction of public triumph and private fragility. In hotel rooms after performances, he would sit at the piano long after the applause had faded, hands hovering over keys as if they could conjure understanding, forgiveness, or solace from the notes themselves. She watched him from the doorway, the light catching in her eyes as she tried to reach him, but the barrier between them, his own fears, his inherited patterns of emotional distance, remained almost imperceptibly firm yet impossible to ignore. Every stolen moment together became a battleground of desire and restraint, a silent negotiation between what he longed to give and what he feared he would lose. The pressure of expectation, the relentless demand to perform, and the private shadows of his own heart created a tension that pulsed in every touch, every glance. Their love existed as a delicate oscillation between devotion and fear, as if each note Benny played carried the weight of a question he could not yet answer. Could love survive the very success it fueled? And then, in a quiet, unremarkable instant, no argument, no dramatic declaration, something shifted. A fragile connection faltered. She stepped away, the distance almost imperceptible, yet enough to fracture the fragile certainty Benny had clung to. The world continued to shine, stages and spotlights waiting for him. Yet in the private corridors of the heart, a rupture had begun, quiet but seismic. Benny felt it, an instinctive knowing that some loss, however gentle in its departure, would echo through decades of music, joy, and sorrow alike. The question lingered in the air as Benny returned to his piano. Was this rupture inevitable, or had it been created by his own fear? And in that question lay a truth he would spend a lifetime confronting, a truth the world had yet to hear. The stage lights were blinding, a halo of brilliance that transformed Benny Andersson from a man into a phenomenon. ABBA's name was on every marquee, every radio, every lip that hummed a melody that had become inseparable from joy itself. The cheers were deafening, a tidal wave of adoration that spilled from packed arenas and intimate television studios alike. Yet beneath the applause, Benny felt a hollow resonance, a silence that no crowd could fill. Each note he played carried an invisible weight, the echo of a love lost, the shadow of the woman who had quietly slipped from his life. Fame had arrived like a storm, but it did not wash away the ache that had accompanied him since childhood. In hotel suites bathed in golden light, Benny would sit at a piano long after the room had emptied, the hum of distant traffic below punctuating his solitude. Fingers hovered over keys that knew the contours of both his triumphs and his regrets. He could play happiness, joy, even exuberance, and yet each melody carried an undercurrent of longing, a secret lament encoded in minor chords and subtle pauses. The world celebrated the brilliance of ABBA, but Benny was acutely aware that every note he offered was also a testament to absence, to the invisible scars left by silence and fear. His collaborators sensed the tension but could not name it. To them, Benny was calm, measured, a quiet anchor amidst the whirlwind of global attention. But beneath the composed exterior, a storm raged. The emotional isolation of success became palpable, the kind that could not be soothed by adoring fans, champagne celebrations, or the applause of thousands. Fame had provided him with a voice the world could hear, but it had not taught him how to speak the truths he had kept locked away for decades. In every photograph, behind every smile, lingered a private shadow, an awareness that perfection on stage could not erase imperfection in the heart. Even in moments of intimacy with friends or fellow musicians, Benny carried the tension of unspoken grief. He laughed, he joked, he created, yet there was always a distance, an invisible partition separating the man from the world that adored him. Music became both sanctuary and obsession. It allowed him to channel his pain into beauty, but it also became a refuge from the very emotional confrontations he needed most. The melodies were rich, layered, and intricate, yet the composer behind them wrestled with isolation that no success could dispel. And then came the quiet moments, after the stadium emptied, after the stage lights had dimmed, when Benny would remain seated, the room thick with shadows, and the ghost of what he had lost would press against his chest. The woman who had once shared his life lingered in every refrain, every echo of minor chords that spoke more truth than the public would ever hear. The tension, built over years of success and private grief, reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Something within Benny was breaking, not with noise or spectacle, but with the subtle inevitability of suppressed longing finally demanding recognition. The world celebrated a genius. Benny endured a loneliness that no audience could fill, and as he lifted his hands above the keys for one final note in the empty suite, a fracture began to widen. A fracture that would eventually force him to confront the private losses that had quietly defined his life. The brilliance outside could not mask the emptiness within. The music had slowed, though the world's memory of ABBA continued to shimmer with incandescent light. Benny Andersson's name remained etched in charts, interviews, and the hearts of millions. Yet the stage that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed distant, almost foreign. The roar of the crowd, the thrill of the spotlight, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. All of it had become a background hum, replaced by a gnawing quiet that pressed against him like the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. Alone in a dimly lit Stockholm apartment, Benny felt the walls close in, the shadows of his past extending, stretching to touch every corner of his being. This was the era of private unraveling, a slow-motion descent into a personal darkness that no fame could illuminate. He moved through rooms as if walking underwater, each gesture slowed by a weight of guilt and grief he could not articulate. Photographs of performances, framed gold records, letters of admiration. All of it mocked him with reminders of what he had built and what he had failed to preserve. The woman he had loved, the one whose absence had been quietly felt for decades, lingered in memory as both muse and phantom. Every minor chord he touched on the piano resonated with her absence, and with it, the deep fear that he had sabotaged something irreplaceable. His fingers trembled slightly over the keys, not from age or fatigue, but from the tension of unspoken regrets that demanded attention yet offered no resolution. Benny's private life became a labyrinth of reflection and confrontation. He would sit by windows during long Swedish nights, gazing at rain streaking down panes, the distant sounds of the city muted by introspection. He confronted himself in mirrors, in photographs, in melodies that carried more of his soul than he dared confess aloud. Anxiety became a constant companion, gnawing at the edges of concentration and comfort. Sleep eluded him, replaced by endless cycles of thought and recollection. He analyzed every decision, every retreat, every failure to speak the truth when it might have saved love. Even the smallest interactions carried echoes of the past, triggering flashbacks to moments when fear had dictated choice, leaving tenderness unexpressed and opportunity quietly abandoned. The world had seen Benny Andersson as a composed, unflappable genius. The world had not seen him collapse behind closed doors. The contrast between public adoration and private torment created a dissonance so acute that it infiltrated every facet of his life. Meals were eaten in silence, rehearsals were approached with mechanical precision, and conversations with collaborators carried an undercurrent of detachment he could neither disguise nor explain. Music had always been a refuge, yet it now reflected the fractures he had long avoided acknowledging. Every note became a dialogue with the past, a reckoning that demanded honesty he was not yet prepared to deliver. And yet, in this darkness, there was a moment of clarity, an awareness that some wounds, no matter how deeply buried, demand confrontation. Benny realized that silence had allowed fear and avoidance to govern the narrative of his life. The woman he lost had become a symbol not just of failed love, but of every compromise he had made to protect himself from vulnerability. The emotional weight of decades threatened to crush him entirely, yet it also illuminated a path forward. The possibility that speaking the truth, at long last, could bring liberation, if not forgiveness. Benny Andersson sat at his piano, the room heavy with unspoken memories and the residual warmth of fading daylight. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly, poised between retreat and revelation. Outside, the world remained oblivious, still clapping for the man who had given it so much joy. Inside, a reckoning waited, quiet, inevitable, and unavoidable. Benny faced a choice that would define not only his remaining years but the way history remembered the private man behind the music. And in that suspended moment, the question that had haunted him for decades hung in the air. Could he finally speak the truth, or would the weight of silence claim him entirely? At 78, Benny Andersson moved with the deliberate calm of a man who had finally learned to sit with the weight of his own history. The world knew him as a composer, a master of melody, the architect of ABBA's indelible sound. But the story he carried was far more fragile, far more intimate than any headline could capture. The silence that had followed decades of fame, of performances, of accolades, was no longer a shield. It had become a companion he could no longer ignore. The truth he had long deferred, the private heartbreak, now demanded articulation. Not for scandal, not for attention, but for the simple act of release. Benny's home, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon light, reflected a life both rich and quietly haunted. The piano, scarred from decades of use, held the weight of triumph and sorrow alike. Fingers traced familiar keys, coaxing notes that were both confession and consolation. In those chords, the presence of the woman he had loved, lost through fear, distance, and silence, was palpable. She was no longer physically there, yet in melody, in memory, she remained a defining element of his emotional landscape. Every cadence, every pause, was a conversation long deferred, a reconciliation of what had been broken and what might still be honored through acknowledgement. Speaking now was an act of courage, the kind that arrives only after decades of reflection. Benny did not speak to condemn or blame. He spoke to reclaim agency over his own story. Love lost had shaped his music, his choices, and his internal life, and acknowledging it was neither easy nor convenient. Yet, in the process, there was liberation. His voice, seasoned by years of restraint and reflection, carried the weight of honesty, tender yet unflinching. He recounted the moments of retreat, the fear that had silenced him, and the subtle decisions that allowed absence to define intimacy. There was sorrow, yes, but also clarity. In truth, he found not only grief but understanding, not only loss but a faint, enduring sense of closure. The act of revelation rippled through his consciousness, reshaping how he perceived decades of art, success, and identity. He realized that the melodies the world had celebrated were more than music. They were an intricate record of survival, of love unspoken, of resilience forged in quiet isolation. Each song became a testament to emotional complexity, a conversation that transcended time, that spoke to longing, regret, and the courage to face one's own shadows. Benny understood that legacy was not solely measured by fame or record sales, but by the honesty he brought to the human heart through art. And as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the apartment, Benny paused. The weight of decades of silence pressed lightly, no longer suffocating, but present enough to remind him that truth, though delayed, was enduring. He lifted his hands above the piano once more, poised not for performance, but for a dialogue with the past, a reconciliation with memory, and a quiet offering to the world he had long cherished. The question that had followed him for so long, the question of love lost, of connection broken, of words unspoken, finally found its voice. Benny Andersson had chosen to speak, and in doing so, the music of his life transformed from melody into confession, from performance into liberation.